The day the Tennessee Board of Medical Examiners began their depositions, I knew my life was about to change again. This time, it was all about whether I could keep my medical license. Dr. Brookhoff, a friend who had been through the fire a few times, was doing everything he could to help me. He even went to the medical schools in Memphis and Nashville, begging the older professors to speak up for me, but they were too scared to get involved. They'd whisper to Dr. Brookhoff, "He's a good doctor, and he takes good care of his patients, but we just can't get involved right now." The medical board's lawyer, Yarnell Beatty, started by deposing me. Then it was Dr. Brookhoff's turn. Beatty was curious about how I had treated some of my patients with narcotic medications. Dr. Brookhoff surprised everyone by saying that my patients weren't getting enough medication. He told a story about Mrs. Kramer, a patient I had given codeine for pain. Dr. Brookhoff thought she needed morphine. When he gave her the morphine, she came back the next week and said it was too strong, so he gave her a weaker painkiller. He was clear, Mrs. Kramer was not a drug abuser. A few weeks later, my hearing in Nashville was set to begin. Dr. Brookhoff and my pastor, Father Viraniran, were there to support me. My lawyer, Dan Warlick, was a pro. We had met years ago when he was investigating Elvis Presley's death. Warlick was smart and knew how to handle the board. He had gathered 25 witnesses and estimated that my defense would take 6 days, but the state wasn't interested in a settlement. They wanted me to admit guilt, which I couldn't do. The hearing started like any other, with 3 days of testimony from 3 witnesses. On the 4th day, things changed. Warlick was ready to shake things up. He had a plan to challenge the state's expert witness, Dr. Roland W. Gray. Dr. Gray had a long history of working with the medical board, always claiming that the medication I prescribed was in addictive quantities. Warlick asked Dr. Gray if there was any evidence that the patients were taking the medication for anything other than pain. Dr. Gray said no. Then Warlick asked if there was any evidence that the patients were taking the medication for a high. Again, Dr. Gray said no. Warlick pushed further, and Dr. Gray admitted that he assumed most of the drug notations in the patient's records were mine, even though I had referred them to other specialists. Warlick then asked Dr. Gray about his current role at the treatment center. Dr. Gray stumbled, admitting he didn't have a title or a position on the medical staff. Warlick's face lit up. He turned to the board president, Dr. Oscar McCallum, and said, "Dr. McCallum, I move that Dr. Gray be disqualified as an expert witness." Dr. McCallum was furious. He said Warlick's request was just a legal trick, and that Dr. Gray had been a good expert for the board for years. The administrative judge agreed that Warlick had a valid concern, but Dr. McCallum wouldn't budge. He said the board didn't need expert testimony to make their judgment. Warlick tried to argue, but Dr. McCallum cut him off, saying the board was the final authority on medicine in Tennessee. The room was tense. The administrative judge covered his face, knowing that Warlick had just given us grounds for appeals that could overturn rulings from the past. Dr. McCallum adjourned the hearing, and the board members rushed out. The hearings dragged on for nearly a year. By the end, the board had narrowed down their focus to one patient, Jerry Lee Lewis. They said I had violated federal law in his treatment, and decided to revoke my medical license. Warlick filed an appeal, challenging the state's so-called expert. For a while, I could still practice, but only with Schedule IV medications, which meant I had to find other doctors to treat my most critical patients. The Elvis Presley controversy still haunted me. One day, a friend sent me an article from the Tennessean. It was about a new pathologist being sought for Elvis's autopsy, 17 years after his death. The article mentioned that a dentist named Smith had been fighting for years to expose what he saw as misconduct by Dr. Jerry Francisco, the original medical examiner. The story said that drugs might not have been the cause of Elvis's death. In 1994, the state finally released a new autopsy report. They had hired Dr. Joseph Davis, a former chief medical examiner from Florida, to review all the evidence. Dr. Davis concluded that drugs did not kill Elvis Presley. He said Elvis died of a heart attack, not from drug overdose. The levels of drugs in Elvis's body were lower than initially thought, and there was no fluid in his lungs, which would have been present if he had died from respiratory failure due to drugs. The report was reviewed by a panel of toxicologists, including Dr. Kevin Marijan. Dr. Marijan had previously said, the death is not the result of multiple drug ingestion. He compared the drug levels in Elvis's body with those in his forensic toxicology references, and found that the levels were not as high as initially reported. The board's decision hung over me like a dark cloud. I was still fighting to clear my name, not just for my patients, but for the truth about Elvis Presley. Dr. Marijan, the doctor who looked at Elvis's drug levels, explained everything to me. He said that Elvis had codeine in his system, but not enough to cause his death. The levels in his liver and kidney were much lower than what would be considered a fatal overdose. The same went for morphine, which is what codeine turns into in the body after it's taken. The amounts were very small, and Dr. Marijan thought Elvis probably took codeine, not morphine directly. He also found diazepam, which is a drug called Valium. But again, the levels were so low that it couldn't have caused Elvis's death. The metabolites, which are the leftovers of the drug after the body processes it, were also very low. Dr. Marijan guessed that Elvis might have taken Valium about 12 hours before his death, but the levels were nowhere near what would be needed for an overdose. There were other drugs too, like ethchlorovinol, a sedative from the 1950s and 1960s, and amibarbital, a short-acting barbiturate. But the levels of these drugs were also too low to be the cause of death. Phenobarbital, another sedative, was present in such a small amount that it wouldn't even make someone sleepy. Methaqualone, also known as Quaaludes, was a bit different. The blood level was close to what could be dangerous, but without knowing the levels in the liver and kidney, Dr. Marijan couldn't say for sure if it was enough to cause death. However, he still didn't think it was the main reason Elvis died. Dr. Marijan was really clear that none of these drugs alone or together could have caused Elvis's death. He said that if Elvis was awake or alert when he died, it couldn't have been from an overdose. People who die from drug overdoses usually fall asleep and stop breathing, and there was no evidence that Elvis did that. Dr. Marijan disagreed with the report from the bioscience laboratory, which said Elvis died from taking too many drugs. He thought they were trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. He believed Elvis died of natural causes, but the media and the public didn't want to accept that. They had already decided that Elvis died from a drug overdose, and they weren't going to change their minds. Years later, I found out that one of the doctors who worked on the bioscience laboratory report, Dr. Dwight Reed, admitted that the polypharmacy ruling was just an opinion, not a medical certainty. But by then, it was too late. The media and the public had already made up their minds, and no one wanted to hear that Elvis might have died naturally. I felt really bad about Elvis being labeled as a drug overdose victim, but I couldn't do anything about it. I was still fighting my own battles with the medical board. They were trying to take away my medical license, and I was doing everything I could to keep practicing. In 1995, the medical board sent me a letter with an offer to settle. They wanted me to admit to all the charges, but I couldn't do that. I hadn't done anything wrong, and I wasn't going to lie to make my problems go away. In the end, the board revoked my license anyway. They said it was to protect the health and safety of the citizens of Tennessee, but it felt like they were just using their power to get rid of me. I was in a tough spot. I had no job and no income, but I was lucky to have a friend in Jerry Lee Lewis. He needed someone to help him with travel and personal matters, and he asked me to be his road manager. It wasn't a full-time job, but it gave me some income and kept me close to the medical field. I traveled with Jerry Lee for 4 years, and it was a great experience. He was performing night after night, and it was amazing to see him thrive. I tried to appeal the board's decision, but it was a long and difficult process. I had a lot of support from patients and other doctors, but the board wasn't budging. I even went through some courses and therapy to address what they called codependency issues, but it didn't make a difference. In 1999, I filed a new application to practice medicine, but the board denied it. They didn't want to hear what I had to say, and they were still holding a grudge from the past. I was out of options and out of money. After 20 years of fighting, it was over. I had to face the reality that my career as a doctor was finished. After I lost my medical license, I felt lost. I had spent so much time trying to help Elvis and other patients, and suddenly, I couldn't do that anymore. I tried to find ways to stay involved in the medical field, but it was hard. I couldn't get malpractice insurance or admit patients to hospitals, even when I found a doctor who was willing to supervise me in a wound and burn unit. It didn't work out. It was frustrating because I knew how much help doctors were needed, but no one would even consider me for a paramedical position. I kept thinking about the past. There was a time when I was the only doctor performing kidney dialysis in the South. I felt like I had so much to offer, but now it seemed like no one wanted my help. It was a tough pill to swallow. In 2000, my friend Fred Smith, who runs Federal Express, gave me a lifeline. He offered me a job as a medical advisor at FedEx International. It was a full-time position with benefits, and I could still be involved in the medical field. My job was to review the treatments FedEx employees received and make sure they followed company guidelines. It was a big help, and it kept me connected to the medical world, even though I couldn't treat patients directly. I learned about new procedures and treatments, which was really important to me. But after 6 years, FedEx outsourced my job and I was out of work again. I felt like I was back at square one. I missed being a doctor, and it was hard to find another job in the medical field. I had to accept that things had changed, and I might not be able to practice medicine in the same way again. Over the years, I've thought a lot about what I could have done differently with Elvis. I talked to Dr. Dan Burkhoff about it. He reminded me that I was trying to help Elvis live his best life, even if it was a weird and extraordinary one. I treated each patient as an individual, not just a case to follow a recipe. That's the art of being a doctor, and I did my best. I've come to terms with my journey. I focus on the good times, like the moments when Elvis burst onto the stage and the crowd went wild. Those memories are a gift, and I'm grateful for them. I no longer obsess over what might have been. One day, about 15 years after I lost my license, I was napping when my phone rang. It was my writer, asking if I was watching TV. I turned it on and saw the breaking news. Michael Jackson had died. The scene was eerily similar to the day Elvis died. An ambulance leaving a house, a famous entertainer not breathing, and the world in shock. The media started comparing Elvis and Michael's deaths. People wondered if there were similarities. I talked to Dr. Kevin Merrigan about it. He explained that the drugs involved in Michael's death, like propofol, were very different from what Elvis was taking. Propofol is a powerful anesthetic that can be dangerous if not used properly. Dr. Merrigan said that the idea of drugs working together to cause an overdose, or polypharmacy, is more of a theory than a proven fact. He thought that Elvis's body had built up a tolerance to the drugs he was taking, so they were less effective over time. I remembered how hard I tried to help Elvis with his insomnia. I changed his medications often, hoping to find something that would work. Dr. Merrigan suggested that taking breaks from certain drugs, or drug holidays, could help make them more effective again. Even though things didn't turn out the way I hoped, I'm at peace with my choices. I did the best I could for my patients, and I'll always remember the good times. I sat there, reflecting on the years that had passed since Elvis's death. Dr. Merrigan and I were deep in conversation, discussing the details that had surrounded the King of Rock and Roll's passing. I explained how we were giving Elvis phenobarbital, a long-acting barbiturate to prevent seizures. He had a serious seizure once in St. Louis, when we found him almost dead in his hotel room. It was a scary moment, and we were doing everything we could to keep him safe. People often assume that if someone is taking a lot of pills, they must be a drug addict, but it's not that simple. When a patient becomes tolerant to a medication, their brain receptors start to shut down. The medication can't get to where it needs to go, and it stops working. It doesn't make the person high. It just makes them sick or toxic. That's why doctors try to avoid prescribing medication for too long, to prevent tolerance from building up. You can't just look at the drug levels in someone's body and say they overdosed. You have to look at the whole picture, as Dr. Merrigan agreed. Dr. Merrigan emphasized that interpreting the data is the most important part. Different testing methods can give different results, and 10 doctors could look at the same data and come up with 10 different explanations. We don't know exactly what happened to Elvis, but we do know that the data doesn't point to a drug overdose. If Elvis had all those drugs in his system and was symptomatic, how did he even make it to the bathroom? I mentioned my theory that the Valsalva maneuver might have played a part. Elvis might have strained, causing his heart rate to slow down. When his heart tried to compensate, it overcompensated, causing an arrhythmia and his blood pressure to drop, making him lose consciousness. Dr. Marijan thought it was possible, but he also pointed out that if Elvis had passed out, he probably would have regained consciousness. He believed Elvis had a heart arrhythmia for some reason, but why it happened at that specific moment is a mystery. Dr. Marijan also considered the possibility of a seizure. Elvis could have had a seizure, which would fit with the idea of withdrawal rather than an overdose. People in barbiturate withdrawal can die if untreated, but you can cold turkey narcotics and survive, even if you feel like you're dying. He thought it was more likely that Elvis had a withdrawal syndrome or a withdrawal seizure than an overdose. We talked about how my life had been affected by all of this. The loss of my medical license fueled my desire to find out what really killed Elvis. It was unfair how Elvis was labeled as a drug abuser after his death, and people were using his passing to find their own redemption. Dr. Marijan had seen the autopsy and the forensic toxicology report. He knew Elvis didn't die from an overdose. He believed I did nothing to harm Elvis with my prescriptive habits, and I had been investigated to the max. Elvis's death wasn't just a loss for him. It was a loss for everyone who knew and loved him. He was a good guy who did a lot for his community and his fans. It was heartbreaking to see people take shots at him after he was gone, and it was even more painful to see how it affected my reputation. Dr. Marijan reminded me that sometimes you do the best you can, and it works out, and sometimes it doesn't. But that's life. He was right, and I knew it. Despite everything, I had to keep moving forward and remember the good times. The conversation with Dr. Marijan was a reminder of the complexity of Elvis's death and the impact it had on so many lives. It was a bittersweet moment, but it was also a time to reflect on the truth and the legacy of a man who meant so much to so many people. Elvis influenced so many lives, and his story has been told in many ways. I've read about him in books, heard from people who knew him, and even seen some of the official papers that tell parts of his life. Let me share with you some of what I've learned. Books about Elvis are like pieces of a big puzzle. Some focus on his music, others on his movies, and some on his personal life. One book, Last Train to Memphis by Peter Guralnick, tells about how Elvis became famous. It talks about his early years in Memphis and how he started singing. Another book, Careless Love, also by Guralnick, talks about the challenges Elvis faced later in his life, like his battles with drugs and his relationship with Priscilla. Joe Esposito, who was Elvis's bodyguard, wrote a few books too. In Good Rockin' Tonight, he shares his memories of Elvis and the times they spent together. There's also Elvis Straight Up, where Joe talks about the real Elvis, not just the superstar. Priscilla Presley, Elvis's ex-wife, wrote Elvis and Me. It's a very personal book that gives a close look at their life together. She talks about the good times and the tough ones, and it helps you understand Elvis as a person, not just a star. The people who worked with Elvis, like Dr. George Nishapoulos, were also part of his story. Dr. Nick, as he was known, was Elvis's doctor for many years. He was there when Elvis died, and he faced a lot of challenges because of it. There are interviews and court documents that talk about Dr. Nick's role in Elvis's life. For example, there are interviews with Dr. Nishapoulos where he talks about the medications he gave Elvis and why he made those choices. Elvis's death was a big shock to everyone. The news spread quickly, and people were devastated. The newspapers, like the Memphis Press Scimitar, covered it in detail. They wrote about how Elvis was found in his bathroom at Graceland, and how his family and fans reacted. There were also articles about the investigation into his death, which was complicated because of the drugs found in his system. People who knew Elvis, like his friends and family, have shared their stories too. For example, Nancy Rooks, who was Elvis's maid, wrote a book called Inside Graceland. She talks about what it was like to live and work at Graceland, and the things she saw there. Her stories give a different perspective on Elvis's life. Then there are the legal documents and court cases that came after Elvis's death. These papers talk about the legal battles over his estate and the investigations into his death. Dr. Nishopoulos faced a lot of scrutiny and even lost his medical license for a time. There are court documents that detail the hearings and the decisions that were made. All these stories and documents help paint a picture of Elvis's life. They show that he was more than just a famous singer. He was a complex person with his own struggles and joys. Reading about his life and the people who knew him helps us understand why he remains so important to so many people, even today. I'm Dr. Nick, and I've had a life that's been anything but ordinary. From my early days as a young boy in Pennsylvania to my medical training at Vanderbilt and the University of Tennessee, I've always been driven by a passion to help others. My career took a turn when I met Elvis Presley. I became his personal physician, and our paths were intertwined for the last decade of his life. Elvis was more than just a patient. He was a friend. I traveled with him on many of his tours, and we shared some incredible moments, but there were also hard times. Elvis struggled with health issues, and I did my best to manage his pain and illnesses. After his passing in 1977, my life changed. I faced challenges and accusations that were difficult to bear. My medical license was eventually taken away, and I had to find a new path. Despite everything, I'm proud of the work I did. I've always tried to do what I thought was right, even when it was tough. I'm still in Memphis, where I've lived for most of my life. I have a wonderful family, my wife Edna, our children Kissy, Elaine, and Dean, and now grandchildren and great-grandchildren. They mean the world to me. Looking back, I see that my life with Elvis was a unique journey. It had its highs and lows, but it was a journey that shaped who I am. I'm grateful for the memories and the people I've met along the way. Even though my medical career ended, I still find ways to contribute and help others. That's what I've always wanted to do, and that's what I'll always do. Elvis's legacy lives on, and so does mine. We were both part of a story that will never be forgotten. Memphis, with its vibrant music scene and rich history, will always be home to me. It's where I started, and it's where I'll stay. Even on Beale Street, you can still feel the energy of the music that Elvis brought to the world. It's a part of me, and I'm a part of it.